Well, hello, everyone. On behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and our partner, the MIT Press, I would like to welcome you to session 2 of our Autotheories Forum. This session is titled Autotheories Then and Now. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. As always, we'd like to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Rautoush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment in an offering of respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. In our second session, Alex Brostoff and Vilashini Cooppan are joined by Laura Cernat. They will pose the questions: how did auto theory emerge, and in what critical and historical debates is it rooted? The discussion will explore how the self is produced in writing, how language fleshes us, and what our selves, texts, and worlds emerge. Laura Cernat is a Flemish Research Foundation postdoctoral researcher at KU Leuven, Belgium. She has contributed to the volumes Virginia Woolf and Heritage, published in 2017, Theory in the Post-Era, which was published in 2021, Imagining Gender in Biographical Fiction, which was published in 2022, also From Shakespeare to Autofiction, which was just recently published, and Experimental Life Writing Today, which is forthcoming this year, amongst others. Ms. Cernat has published in Biography and Interdisciplinary Quarterly, Partial Answers, and African American Review. She has guest edited a special issue on autofiction and auto theory in 2022, and co-edited a special issue on Eastern European women's life writing in 2023, as well as the forthcoming Routledge Companion to Biofiction. Laura Cernat has presented over 20 international conferences worldwide and was the main organizer of the hybrid bilingual conference Biofiction as World Literature in 2021. Join us now in offering a warm welcome to Alex Brostoff, Vilashini Cooppan, and Laura Cernat. Thank you for being with us today. It's such an honor to have you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Once again, we want to give our deepest thanks to the City Lights Foundation, to the MIT Press, of course, to Peter for inviting us to be here today, to Victoria Hindley, our editor at MIT, and David Olson, our publicist extraordinaire. And of course, to Laura, who is an auto theory expert and is here today to join us in thinking about auto theory then and now. So in our last session, Vilashini and I wrapped up with the question, where did auto theory come from? And one of the things that we were discussing as we concluded is that there's a problem with origin stories, right? To ask where does auto theory come from implicitly runs the risk of suggesting a singular story or a kind of monolithic meta-narrative that would pinpoint where and when and with whom auto theory began, and then draw a straight line to the present. Our volume, Auto Theories, troubles the singularity of origin stories by underscoring the plural origins of auto theory. So what we want to start by talking about today are those many different histories of auto theory. And some of the moments and movements through which auto theory as a practice has emerged, thinking about the many different critical and historical debates in which it's been rooted. So I'll kick us off just by talking a little bit about my own research, which Vilashini mentioned at the end of our final session. One of the many origin stories that I'm thinking about in terms of where auto theory came from is from the incredible anthology, This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, published in 1981. So in that volume, which is co-edited by Gloria Ansaldúa and Sherry Moraga, they talk about what they call theory in the flesh. And they write, quote, "A theory in the flesh means one where the physical realities of our lives, our skin color, the land or concrete we grew up on, our sexual longings, all fuse to create a politic born of necessity. Here we attempt to bridge the contradictions in our experience." So in my own work, I'm really interested in thinking about the ways in which a term such as auto theory, when it's projected retroactively on the past, it runs the risk of effacing other moments and movements with corollary practices. So theory in the flesh, like auto theory, right, is working through, metabolizing those contradictions in experience, bringing together the physical realities of our lives in order to, quote, create a politic born of necessity. So, and of course, this is absolutely central to queer women of color feminisms of the early 80s, and what we now refer to as queer of color critique. So I want to hand it over to Vilashini and to Laura to talk about all of these many different origin stories and histories through which we see auto theory emerging.
Right. And thank you so much, Alex, for that terrific map. And the way you've imprinted yourself onto it, because to sketch out a set of theoretical origin stories is, I think, for any kind of theory to place oneself in relationship to it. But I think there's something particularly intimate, particularly linked, particularly skin close about the relationship between the texts that constellate auto theory for us and then the larger universe of it. So I think we all have our centers of gravity. And one of the things that's been amazing and exciting about working with Alex is that we have some in common and there's a Venn diagram, and we have some that are distinct. And so it's sort of like the most intimate process of getting to live what somebody else's loves, and to understand this broader thing. So for me, I have, as you know from the previous session, I have been long interested in the harnessing of first person narration and a kind of mixed assemblage of different kinds of critical and analytic writing. You see it in Frantz Fanon's Black Masks, Black Skin, White Masks. You see it in W.E.B. Du Bois's Turn of the Century, The Souls of Black Folk. I think it pops up through a lot of the sort of tradition of civil rights writing and later stage 1980s, early post-colonial work. You see it in the 50s in anti-colonial work. So that's one tradition that is certainly really interesting to me as one of several origin points for auto theory. The other is post-structuralism, and is specifically this moment in which, through people like Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, feminist critics such as Julia Kristeva, or Luce Irigaray, people are exploring the possibilities of a linguistic and language-based theory for modeling the thing that identity is, right? Identity is no longer its own thing. It's something that is always being, and I think if you, Alex, translate it, born across. Something is lost in that process. Something doesn't arrive at the sender. It's not a complete and direct download. And for me, the ways in which language got in the way of direct deliveries of identities or of concepts was important. Secondly, the people I've mentioned, largely French writers working in the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, I think had in common a particular kind of style, right? A playfulness, a swimming in the deep of language, favoring, if you think of Derrida, word games, favoring a kind of deeply embodied style of writing for Irigaray. So one question I also have is, as you think, Laura, about constellations that for you are important in auto theory, I'm curious what they are. what might be some of those texts, and also what is there to say about their style? Because I'm hoping in this session we can get to the question of several defining characteristics of autotheoretical writing, including style.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to start by saying that auto theory, to my mind, is indeed argonautic in its own right, because it started out as one thing, and now perhaps the label has stayed the same, but the content has changed. So in that sense, that's perhaps one of the many reasons for which Maggie Nelson's book has been so closely associated with the genre. But because you asked the question of the problem of origin story, that you both said you were skeptical of the idea that an origin story can be told about auto theory. I guess the first thing, the first name to think about is indeed Jacques Derrida, and we were talking of him. You mentioned him just now, and we were also talking with Peter about him before. And why do I think he is so important? Because, well, to my mind, one of the seminal texts that hasn't, to my knowledge, been discussed so much by him is Ses Confessions. His text about Saint Augustine, which is at the same time a text about his mother's illness and death, which is basically, by all definitions, almost all definitions that we can imagine, an auto theory. And yet we haven't thought about it that way, because perhaps it wasn't a label that was circulating at that time. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I'm thinking about Derrida. The other reason is that what he does in this dangerous supplement from grammatology is not just a theoretical exercise, it's also a reflection on embodiment.
Yes.
So although I wouldn't consider it auto theory in the most limited, restricted definition, I would still see it in the same constellation, as you said, because it does deal with how does the body lead or relate to theory, and that entire thing about Rousseau and well, masturbation, but at the same time absence and presence, and tokens of the other, and living off of the tokens of the other. All of these things make him an underestimated precursor of auto theory. So that's where I would start, but that's also, in doing this, I'm also making an auto theoretical gesture, because many moons ago, back in far away land, and back in Bucharest, I wrote my bachelor thesis on Derrida. And back then, well, Derrida was the air I breathed, but at the same time, the grid through which I interpreted myself. And I had to kind of cast that off with time. And now coming back to him is also an auto-theoretical gesture, but not to dwell too much on the auto and to come back to the theory. Of course, I think for the different constellations that are at the origin of auto theory, I would say one of them is indeed post-structuralism, as you said. I would say without Kristeva, because she's, I mean, well, you could say she does auto theory and auto fiction, but as Annelien Mascalin showed in her article in the special issue I edited, officially, at least, she's against the label auto fiction. So here, there's also this kind of tension. But anyways, yeah, not to digress too much. So there would be maybe 5 or 6 directions of auto theory's rhizomatic roots, let's say. On one hand, we have the post-structuralist strand, which basically emerges from a sort of willingness to play with theory. So it goes from the theory to the auto. It's basically, as Dubrovsky would say, reserved for the famous of this world in the twilight of their lives. It's what Roland Barthes does in A Lover's Discourse, in Barthes par Barthes. It's basically, in Nietzsche's terms, something like that child phase. You know, you go from the camel who wants to inherit a tradition to the lion who wants to proclaim his own vision, and that's what Barthes and Derrida did in the 60s. And then in the 80s, they become, you know, the child. They start toying around with concepts. That's their road into autotheory. Now, the next strand is indeed the feminist strand, which is coming more from the auto to the theory, and which includes this bridge called My Back by Magagan and Alzua, and many of other examples discussed by Logan Fournier in her excellent monograph. I think Audre Lorde is also here. Stacey Young is also here. Many other writers, but this you have covered so well in your book that I don't think it's necessary to dwell so much on that right now. But I think there are a few other strands that some of them do come up in what you have presented, some of them not. There's a strand that I think is slightly different from the gender one. It's the experience strand, I would call it, although it's also written by women. I think it's slightly different because it doesn't come so much from strictly the body, but more from a sort of narrative articulation. And I'm thinking of Jane Gallup's anecdotal theory. I'm thinking of Annie Ernaux's autoethnography, and so on. So these people come to autotheory from experience, not necessarily just from embodiment, but from an experience that is supposed to represent also the social, and also kind of the encounter with theory in practical, I don't know, in practical life. Something happens, and all of a sudden you see theory in it. So that's a little bit different from embodiment, strictly speaking. Then there's a creative critical strand, which is basically experimental, rooted in the notion of experimental literature. And what I'm thinking about with that is this book, Reading and Writing Experimental Texts. I don't know if you know it, by Silverglede and Quinn. And what they do is basically similar to what the first chapter of your book tries to do with the emails from, so Emma Lieber's chapter with the emails from students and exchanges, kind of expose the academic exercise as not just a question of how you present yourself officially, but also kind of behind the curtains, how people connect to each other in academic discourse, which is sometimes semi-theoretical, semi-autobiographical. And then an email can contain, you know, some footnotes and references and suggestions, and then something about your private life. And this is something that I see as a connection between your book and Silverglede and Quinn. So this is also kind of in the same kind of strand of thought as what Mark McGurl called the program era. So the closeness between creative writing and academic writing institutionally has generated this strand of autotheory and experimental literature. Then I think another, I don't have that much left, and I hope I'm not boring.
It's wonderful.
And another strand that I've thought of as autotheoretical in my perception, at least, is the psychoanalytics strand. And this would be, of course, Eve Kosowski, but yeah, that's already discussed. I'm trying to think of a bit outside the box. One of the interesting examples of this is this book, The Good Story, by Arabella Kurtz and J.M. Coetzee, who have worked on kind of theorizing what it means to tell a story about the self and from an ethical perspective. So to my mind, that's also a root, although I wouldn't consider it an auto-theoretical text per se. It basically asks questions that are very close to auto theory. And finally, another, I would say, under discussed tradition that does feed into auto theory is critifiction. Raymond Federman's notion of critifiction, because that's really the critic engaging with the text in playful ways and stepping outside of his official role and official mask in a way. So these would be kind of the roots of what we have now with Maggie Nelson and onwards. And perhaps, well, not to underestimate, of course, Preciado and the trans community, of course, but you've talked about that, and crip studies and crip epistemology. And here we have McRoor and many other writers who have looked at the social implications of disability and the political in auto theory. So that's how I would see roughly the constellation between these things.
Wow,
so
that was dazzling.
Yes, of course, I'm leaving a lot out, I guess. I haven't yet mentioned Chris Cross, haven't yet mentioned Sheila Heti and many others. But Chris Cross is coming 2 days, so I don't think I need to dwell too much on it. But I know that you had perhaps other questions or maybe reflections on what I said, or.
Well, actually, this is a perfect segue. And again, let me say how dazzling that map of the auto-theoretical universe was. It's incredibly helpful and so so precise and so heterogeneous. So I think for our listeners, you can really get a sense that there are many different kind of theoretical plug-ins to distinct fields. And lo and behold, in almost every one of them, it turns out that this insertion of the writer into the language of critique is happening. I mean, we can see this in Freud, not just this idea that the case studies should read like short stories, but the kind of uncanny, symptomatic eruptions of the analyst himself in it. You can see it like you, I am a lover of Derrida. You can see it there all the time. So I think it's interesting as we imagine ourselves as readers of auto theory to think of ourselves looking for certain eruptions that attune us, right? Oh, this is a marker in some ways, not a definitive marker, because they can, obviously, first-person narrative is in so many things more than auto theory. This is why I think the concept of critifiction is really interesting, because it's a self that is also a critic, or what we might say a self who is also a theorist. So we spent a lot of time thinking, what is auto theory? And it seems that the question that also poses is, what is a theorist? And I'm thinking of a famous line by Derrida when asked, what would you most want to know about a famous philosopher? And he said, their sex life, suggesting that it was in fact the embodied personhood of the theorist that was as important as the theory, right? So I'm thinking a little bit about these moments of eruptions of eyes into different genres, whether auto theory, but also autobiography, memoir, testimony, autofiction, your own speciality of biofiction, which can sometimes be written in a first-person voice. So could you talk a little, the I is everywhere, the first-person narrating I. How would you think about it in relationship to some of these genres? And how is it slightly different, if you think it is, in auto theory?
So as a biofiction scholar, I I basically
Maybe say what biofiction is for our audience.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes. So biofiction is, well, according to Michael Lackey's definition, literature that literature that names its protagonist after a real historical figure. So it's basically literature that fudges a biography into fiction. So I came to autotheory by a very roundabout way through autofiction and biofiction. And in a way, I do see all of these as part of life writing, although in biofiction studies, there's currently a debate about whether biofiction is even life writing. But I think if you look at the work of Sydney Smith and Julia Watson, for instance, they already tell you that the category of autobiography is broader and more complex and more nuanced than the straw man that autofiction theorists make it to be. So then I do think that the category of life writing does fit not just strictly autobiography and biography, but also these categories of biofiction, autofiction, autotheory, and so forth. But your question was also about the overlaps between the three. I'd say an overlap between biofiction and autofiction, but also partially autotheory. A perfect example for that is Kate Zambrano's Heroines, because it works with fragments of biofictions of what she calls the mad wives of modernism, and then her own becoming as a writer reflected through these other figures, and also trying to take the theoretical inductive step and move on to creating to articulating a theoretical vision of the self, to understanding the underpinnings of the social structures that have created this self, and especially this neurodivergent self, social structures as well as gender roles and tensions and so on and so forth. So that would be an example where the three, biofiction, autofiction, and autotheory, kind of converge. As for the ways in which autofiction can be autotheoretical, I guess there are a couple of examples that come to mind. One of them is No Archive Will Restore You by Juliet Singh. I think that's kind of it is autotheory with elements of autofiction, with elements of narrative, kind of like Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts. But I think there are also ways to go. So this would be going from autotheory to autofiction, starting with the theoretical question: what is your archive? What do you accumulate as the testimony of your existence? And then building from there to the narrative. You can also go the other way around and start with the autofiction, and then weave in the autotheoretical elements. And that's what Ben Lerner does in 1004, because 1004, everyone considers it an autofiction. But what is autotheoretical about it is the narratological element. So, and the metaleptic play. So I guess the jury's out about whether this makes it an autofiction, an autotheory or not. But I think every metafictional and self-reflexive gesture is implicitly somewhat an autotheoretical gesture.
Why do you think that, actually? Can you say something about why every meta-theoretical gesture is auto-theoretical?
Well, I guess I would say it's because of where this comes from. I think there's very, very little in the way of spontaneous self-reflexive or metafictional gestures. A lot of it comes from theoretical reflection and from the engagement with other texts. Like that's what it comes down to. When you read another text and it makes you look at life in a kind of twisted way, the way Bernard does, that kind of creates the possibility of writing with a theoretical thrust, even when what you are doing is just fiction. But perhaps it's not the perfect example, but one other example, perhaps a little better for why I think there are overlaps between autofiction, biofiction, and autotheory is Coetze's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, He and His Man, where you see exactly the fact that reading another writer and creating a character and creating a metaleptic gesture is actually also a theoretical and political gesture, because what Coetze does in He and His Man is basically admitting that you, as a writer, you are co-created by your character. You're creating your character while your character is also shaping you. So that's kind of similar to what Ben Lerner does as well. So I think in these theoretical gestures, there's to some extent a level of I guess abstraction that transforms autofiction into something akin to autotheory. So I don't think autotheory is necessarily always centered on the I. I think autotheory can also be revolving around a displaced I in the form of he. It can also be, just like biofiction, as Lucia Baldini showed, can be written in the first person, right? So autotheory can be written also in the third person, or very often it can revolve around the name. And I have some autotheoretical examples of that, but I don't know if there's still time for that, because I know at least
maybe just throw out the titles of the examples for us.
Well, no, I meant like another theoretical exercise is what I was thinking of, but perhaps that's overambitious for the framework that we've got. Well, yeah, perhaps I've gone a bit too far with the examples, or.
I think you're good. I mean, we just have a few minutes left before we want to make sure that there's time for the audience to chime in with questions of their own. But maybe I can just ask one more, and this is actually a question for both of you, because I feel like our conversation, and Laura, your brilliant answers, I can hear so much Derrida like lurking in your answers, and I'm so struck by the way you're thinking about how porous the relationships between biofiction, autofiction, and autotheory are. And I really appreciate that, because I think there's this compulsion in which, you know, we're fielding questions all the time. Oh, is this autotheory? Is it not? And like, you know, that those kinds of questions ask us to draw generic lines in the sand. And of course, for me, I have to go back to Derrida's law of genre, which begins, genres are not to be mixed. I will not mix genres, etc. But of course, this is only a preamble to an argument about how the law of genre impairs its own pairing, right? The law of genre, of course, constructs and transgresses the very boundaries that it justifies by exception. So one of the things that I really love about your work, and specifically in the auto theory and auto fiction special issue that you guest edited, is you're thinking about the politics of visibility. And I feel like one of the things that's really come up in this conversation is what auto theory renders visible as a reading practice, but more broadly, what genre might render visible or invisible. So I think just to wrap things up before we turn it over to the audience, I'm wondering, Laura and Vilashini, if maybe we all want to think together about what auto theory renders visible or might, whether intentionally or unintentionally, obscure, and how perhaps this is just the symptomatic trace of genre itself. But I want to think specifically about auto theory's politics of visibility.
Well, thanks for this question. Yes, I think it's been at the core of my reflection on auto theory and on autofiction. And I would say there are two kind of poles in this in the game that's being played with marketing autofiction and auto theory. On one hand, well, basically using a shorthand, I would say there's a risk of a sort of gentrification of auto theory, which is what happened, and that's what I warned about in my introduction. It is in a way what happened with autofiction, because you have authors like Toppolainen, for instance, complaining that they're not considered autofiction, when technically speaking, if we look at strictly the definitions, because his character is not named after himself, it wouldn't classify as autofiction. So basically he's craving for a label of autofiction because of its currency. So if the same would happen to auto theory, then we would just start calling things auto theory just because it's trendy, and then we would lose some of the thrust of its theoretical density. And on the other hand, if we avoid this risk of making auto theory just a label, then we also risk invisibilizing communities who are using auto theory in different ways. So I think there should be like a sort of balance between the two. And another, perhaps a different strand of reflection upon auto theory and visibility, which I find extremely important, which I would like to perhaps submit for reflection and end on, is the question of the visibility of queer people, but also of people with chronic pain or with various mental illness, various forms of mental illness or neurodivergence. And I know Jane Grew touched upon that in your volume. And this the question of how this distance that the medical gaze imposes is negotiated in an auto-theoretical exercise, because theory can be seen as something external the medical discourse can create its own narratives. Jane Grew talks beautifully about Foucault and the birth of the clinic, and how medical observation was born through these narratives that create, that transform the patient into an object, and so on and so forth. So autotheory is exercise towards visibility would be an exercise of establishing one's own theory of the self, one's own observation sheet, as it were, instead of accepting an external observation sheet. And I think these two questions are at the core of my thought on autotheory and visibility. On one hand, the idea of avoiding gentrification, avoiding marginalization, and on the other hand, this conflict with the medical gaze, and this conflict with the heteronormative gaze as well. So these would be my my suggestions on visibility.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Laura. In the interest of time, I want to take a moment to turn it over to the audience to ask what questions folks have. So, Peter, I'm going to invite you back in. I see there's already a really juicy question in the chat.
Indeed. I don't know if I can truncate this without losing bits and pieces, so I'm going to Pierre Carlo says, thank you for this fascinating panel. As an outsider to the field, I'm learning so much from this conversation and look forward to reading the book. Given my own center of gravity, to quote Vilashini, as a scholar of pre-modern East Asia, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the limits and potentials of rereading pre- and early modern texts through autotheoretical lenses. Alex pointed out the risks of projecting autotheory respectively onto the past, but if we take Laura's idea that, quote, every meta-theoretical gesture is also auto-theoretical, unquote, couldn't autotheory also help us rethink what has traditionally been conceived of as autobiography?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess there's the limit that I was. So thank you for this question. It's really interesting food for thought, because it challenges sorry, I have to. Sorry, it's 10 p.m. here, so I hope I'm not diverging too much. I think the reason why we have to be mindful of extending concepts too much is that, in spite of what Derrida said in the Law of Genre, ironically, that he shall not mix genre, and still he does. We do have to pay some attention to periodization. So I do feel that there's something specifically rooted in our historical moment about autotheory. I think we could look at previous metafictional phenomena or meta-theoretical phenomena as an anticipation of autotheory. But to be fully able to say that something is autotheoretical, we'd have to accept its rootedness in a certain fascination with a philosophical culture. So the example that comes to mind, because you said early modern, and that's really a stretch for me to think about it, but the example that comes to mind perhaps is Don Quixote. So Don Quixote's Don Quixote's the novel Don Quixote's gesture of riffing on a previous chivalric tradition would perhaps have the same meta-theoretical density as the thing that Coetzee does in He and His Man, for instance. And you have metalepsis, and you have all these dimensions of theoretical self-awareness in Cervantes' writing. Does that mean that you have autotheory there? You could say you have autofiction to some extent, and that's debatable. But does it mean that you have autotheory and something that that is not rooted in a culture where theory is so worshipped as it is today? I doubt it. So I guess part of autotheory's fascination is it's in a way it's culty dimension, and I'm perhaps simplifying, or I don't mean to belittle it by saying this, but I do feel that in order to understand autotheory, you have to root yourself in the 70s and onwards in a situation where theory was perceived as the air we breathe, and the model that we used to build ourselves as human beings. That's basically what Judith Butler says in the chapter, in the last but one chapter of your book, when she talks about the encounter with theory and Spinoza in the books in her parents' basement. So I think, in a way, perhaps that's a good objection that Pier Carlo has made by kind of calling me out whether really every metafictional gesture is an autotheoretical gesture. Perhaps that's a stretch. I guess an autotheoretical gesture is also a gesture of encountering theory and expecting from theory to receive an answer about your own life. I think in Coetzee you can see that. I think in Cervantes, for instance, you can't see something as ambitious as wanting to find a response to your own life in theoretical works.
Oops, sorry.
Sorry.
I just wanted to, just for time, I wanted to thank you so much, Laura, for this really rich response. And one of the things that it makes me think about is precisely this question of periodization. And I do agree with you that if we want to think a particular kind of self or I that is emerging in auto theory, it is a child of Enlightenment modernity. It is a sense of an I that we've inherited that is constituted by a perceptual apparatus, an I looking out towards a world that sends back various kinds of sensory data, and that emergence of the idea of an individual distinct from the world is, of course, culturally specific. We would not find it in a number of indigenous and non-Western cultures. I mean, the invention of the individual and what then is done in the name of this supposedly freestanding individual, bearer of rights, et cetera, or not bearer of rights, is kind of this massive break in a long, long history of thinking about identity forms. And so I'm particularly fascinated by the way somebody like our mutual love Derrida proclaims the end of man as that specific capital I individual, and is rather interested in the many kinds of discourses, institutions, if you're thinking with Foucault, but structures, right? And mediums that constitute the self. And so I think that I that is auto theory is itself always periodized. And now, people think so much about the media saturation age, the virtualization of the self. What is the self beyond late stage capitalism, endless commodification and proliferation? And sometimes when we think that way, it seems like auto theory has to have only existed in the period of modernity to late capitalism. And I think if we're thinking through the I as a marker of auto theory, that makes a great deal of sense, even though there are so many other ways of understanding an individual, and we also want to take account of them. But it's also true, as you yourself said so helpfully, auto theory isn't only marked by the I, right? It could be written in third person. It could be marked by this meta theoretical reflection. It could be marked by the theory of the body. It could do a lot of different things, and that would necessarily ask us to think about autotheoretical form. So what about the bricolage, assemblaged, Frankensteinian creature piece together nature of a text? Does that lend it to some kind of autotheoretical gesture? Would we reread, for example, the history of Genji, the tale of Genji, which mixes prose, poetry, a kind of confessional, a snapshot of the courtly world of that period, not as auto theory, but as a play with a certain kind of genre-shattering form that was used to be called the Japanese novel, but that's a very colonial way of understanding it. So here again, I think what auto theory teaches us generically is not to taxonomize, but to read for the porous interpenetrations, the hybridizations of genre. A hybrid form wants us to read in a hybrid way.
Absolutely. But then, Vilashini, what you are suggesting then is that any kind of discourse, so it basically doesn't fully contradict what I was trying to say about
no, not at all.
The interest in the culty thing, the sapiosexual attraction to theory that draws us to write in an autotheoretical way. If that's what defines autotheory, then it means that even in the Tale of the Genji, or even in, well, you could say even in Plato, then there is an autotheoretical thrust in the sense that it's through dialogue and through the attraction of philosophy that more knowledge is born. So it's basically a way of rooting the experience of thought in the experience of being attracted to another body who thinks. So if that's how you see autotheory, that's why I think it's a brilliant thing that you named the volume, you titled the volume Autotheories in the plural, because we each theorize the possibilities that derive from being inspired by a lover's discourse, by another person's thought. We each theorize these things and appropriate these things in different ways. So yes, in that sense, I guess to me, what what is the red thread connecting these things is basically becoming conscious of the materiality of thought and the materiality of reading too. That's something that kind of would bring together all these threads that I feel are in a way a little bit rhizomatic again and perhaps torn, is the idea that that through realizing that the materiality of reading and of human contact, of the moment now when we are connecting through a platform, through mediation, realizing that these physical conditions that make thought possible are circumscribing how we think. I think that's kind of at the core of the intellectual exercise of autotheory. And I also find the genre of autotheory, to my mind, is what I would call, paraphrasing Sarah Ahmed's notion of willful subjects, I would call it a willful genre. It's difficult to tame it. So I do feel like trying to connect autotheory to adjacent genres like biofiction, autofiction, and so forth, and trying to include it within life writing is always a fraught exercise, because the question that's being asked is how much of autotheory can apply, is a question of applying theory to the auto, and how much is deriving theory from the auto, from the self.
Right.
So
well, that might be a great note on which to end, and to thank you for this incredible, nuanced, detailed, comprehensive survey of not just what we might think autotheory is, but of all these tentacular relationships that it has with other genres. It's really helpful to think it against and with and through these other things to derive a working idea. And I love that you raise this concept of materiality and of what the auto in autotheory is and how it's constituted around selves, because it lets us talk about the next panel. We hope you'll stay on. It will start in about 15 minutes. But we're going to be thinking about the autotheoretical as a form through which not only selves, but communities are aggregated, groups, solidarities. In what way does the autotheoretical itself provide material for the making of collective imaginations? So Alex and I will be speaking with Elda Maria Roman and Erica Richardson in that next section. I can't thank you enough, Laura, for being with us. And it's just been such a generous thing for you to do, especially at the hour you are in at 10 o'clock.
yes, thank you. And it was really a pleasure to engage with your new work. And thank you again for inviting me and for sending the book to me. I really loved reading it, and I wish you the best with the next launching events and with the rest of the evening.
Thank you so much, Laura. I can't wait to continue the conversation. For everyone in the audience, we're actually going to be starting up again in about 8 minutes. So our next session will start at 1:30, and we hope to see you all again soon. A huge thanks again to Laura for joining us.